Here comes everyone. It's very exciting to see people come in. Lots of very prompt people. We're going to give it just a moment. We're expecting quite a few folks today, and then we will kick it off. My dogs are going to start barking outside. It's life. All right, we're coming up on about 100. I think we're expecting a few more. Everybody really prompt today, which is great. And we'll get started in about a minute. Yeah, anyone who wants to give a shout out to their town, their state, their country in the chat, please feel free to do that. All right, things are slowing down just a bit. Wow, exciting to see everybody's places coming in there. Good afternoon. My name is Heather Staines. I'm pinch hitting for Leah today, and I'm really excited to be able to be part of this webinar. I'm a senior consultant with Delta Think, but I've been in scholarly communications working with publishers and libraries for more than 20 years now. And I love participating in webinars and moderating webinars to learn from really smart people. We just have a few housekeeping slides to kick us off today. Welcome. This session is being recorded. All of the registrants will get a link, whether they were able to attend in person or not today. We have a mechanism to ask questions via the Q&A box, I believe. Feel free to put your question in as soon as it occurs to you, so you don't forget it. We will hold them until the end unless there's some kind of a problem or an urgent clarification that we need to take care of. I'll be watching the chat, so please feel free to put information like that in. After the session today, you will receive a short attendee evaluation that will help us in terms of organizing for future programming. So please return that. I'm sure everyone is a Zoom expert by now, but in the event that you're not, we just have a few slides that Leah put together to help you acclimate to the session. If you're having any issues with your sound, you won't be hearing me, but you can go through the test functionality on your speaker and make sure that everything is working smoothly. Hopefully you will be able to hear us. Let's see here. We've got different view options that you can choose. This is the Q&A box, so feel free to put your questions in there. You can adjust the display on your screen from the version that takes over your whole screen, which I will confess, frankly, kind of freaks me out. To exit full screen, you can play around with how you want to see the speakers and the like. Feel free to do that. Now, without further ado, I'm just going to do a quick intro of our panelists, and they will be taking it from there. I'm told it's a whirlwind tour through a minimum number of slides, so we want to leave the maximum time today for questions and discussions. John Berger will be driving our slides today. He's the Executive Director of ASERL, and they are the reason that we are gathering together today. Lisa Macklin is also participating from Emory University Libraries, Robyn Sinn from Johns Hopkins University, Tucky Taylor from the Journal of Copyright and Education and Librarianship, and last but certainly not least, Robyn Weisman from Vanderbilt University. So I am going to stop sharing and I'm going to hand it over to John to drive the slides for the rest of the presentation.
Good afternoon, folks. This is John Berger. Welcome. I'm assuming everybody's seeing my slides. Somebody give me a thumbs up to yes, thank you. Very pleased to be with you today. My job is just sort of do a little kickoff. For those of you who don't know what ASERL is, I'm happy to see a lot of familiar names and faces on the list. So, but for those of you who don't know ASERL, we are a consortium of 37 large research libraries in 11 Southeastern states. We've been around since the 1950s. For a good bit of that time, it was largely a dean's networking organization. But over the last 20 plus years, we've really started to develop some very substantial programming. One of the things we don't do, I think when people think of research consortia, they think buying clubs and group licensing. We don't do that generally. That's not sort of part of our portfolio. We're really more of what I would consider to be a loose confederation of willing partners. As I said, our members are the largest libraries in their states generally. They have responsibilities within their states to lead programming. So it sort of makes partnerships across state bounds to be a little challenging at times. So we have no mandatory programs. The only things that we do are all opt-in. So we don't have any mandatory technologies, anything along those lines. But we do have some very long-standing protocols, again, all voluntary. We have a very long-standing resource sharing program that's in place at a number of different levels without going into too many details. And then an awful lot of professional development programming. You probably have seen our programming over the last year or so. It's sort of exploded during the pandemic. We've put on more than 100 webinars in the past year, more than 30,000 people. And then communities of interest, of which this is a project from there. Starting with our scholarly communications group, but then very quickly morphing with our resource sharing group and collection management group, and a number of other things there. One of the things that we are very fortunate of is to have access to a lot of really smart people, including many of our libraries have scholarly communications experts. Many of them have their own law degrees, as Lisa does. So it makes developing these kinds of programs relatively easy for us to do. And last but not least, when we put this guide together, it's designed to sort of provide the pros and cons of controlled digital lending. We're not advocating for one particular position or another. You know, I can tell you I have somebody on my board of director who is a lawyer librarian and very much thinks that that controlled digital lending is definitely within the purview of fair use. And I have a dean who just got out of the 12-year lawsuit from publishers. He's at the Georgia State University. So, you know, he's a little more cautious when it comes to these kinds of things. So that's sort of the intro. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Robyn Weisman at Vanderbilt.
Yes, the pandemic presented complicated challenges to academic libraries, particularly in the areas of access. Physical spaces were closed at most ASERL libraries, and users were unable to go on site to access materials needed for research. Universities began announcing plans for distance classes in varying degrees. Some, such as Vanderbilt University, offered a hybrid model where students had the choice to take classes online via Zoom or on site. Others, such as Johns Hopkins University, moved to an online-only model and did not have students back to campus. The one thing every library had in common is that the overwhelming majority of their users were now distance learners. This was particularly challenging for making specific library collections available, the most vital of which was reserves. Previously, the majority of ASERL libraries had active reserves collections which housed physical materials needed for classes, such as textbooks. Even if the book was available electronically, most libraries tended to purchase the physical copy since ebooks tend to be more expensive, especially when it came to purchasing access for multiple users. Physical reserves materials were made inaccessible to users by the pandemic. Another part of library collections that were rendered inaccessible were texts that were unavailable electronically. Older texts and foreign language texts were less likely to be digitized, and there was still a demand for these by users in disciplines such as history, and various forms of international studies to continue their research. Since library facilities were closed to library users, and in many cases, library staff that were not cleared to go back on site, there was really only one option. These texts needed to be made available electronically so that users anywhere, be they a professor isolating at home blocks from campus or a suddenly distant student at home in China, could fill their research needs and continue their learning as seamlessly as possible. CDL, or controlled digital lending, presented itself as a logical answer to this challenge. In 2018, the white paper on controlled digital lending by Kyle Courtney of Harvard and Dave Hansen at Duke made CDL a not unfamiliar term with ASERL libraries. In the immediate aftermath of the pandemic, many ASERL libraries became users of HathiTrust's Emergency Temporary Access Service, or ETAS, which by necessity brought the concept of CDL to the forefront of the minds of library staff previously unfamiliar with the concept. Could a service similar to what HathiTrust was providing be improvised by libraries to enable immediate access to vital collections such as reserves, which needed to be accessible in order for many classes to move forward? Could the service be adapted in some way to make texts available to users by request, even if they weren't needed by reserves and were not available electronically in any other way? And now I will pass on to my colleague.
I remembered to unmute, yay. So John and other people at ASERL had a lot of questions, from everything from what is CDL to is it applicable in our particular institution, and then within all the different units within the library that CDL could help maybe. So there were lots of discussions throughout ASERL and between ASERL friends and colleagues, director level conversations, scholarly communications, librarians, resource sharing, reserves units. They all had similar questions, but not identical questions because they're all at different levels of stakeholders, different levels of understanding around CDL. So what we heard, what primarily John heard, and kind of came to the conclusion that what would help at this point would be some kind of a framework or a guide that was not quite as theoretical as the Hansen and Courtney paper. So I will let Lisa talk now.
Thanks, Robyn. So among the ASERL libraries, we really wanted to move from a consideration of the questions around CDL to something that was a more practical guide. And our idea was that if we created something that could be shared with administrators and others to facilitate discussion and decision-making about CDL in individual libraries, that would be a good contribution to our colleagues. So we started really with definitions, leaning very heavily on the white paper that Robyn mentioned by Kyle Courtney at Harvard and Dave Hansen at Duke. And we considered some of the possibilities of how CDL offers for getting materials into the hands of library users. As Robyn mentioned, this was really highlighted by the pandemic. And we had a number of ASERL libraries relying on the HathiTrust Emergency Temporary Access Service, or ETAS, which has characteristics which distinguish ETAS from other implementations of CDL, like the Internet Archives and National Emergency Library. So most of you, if not all of you, are aware that there's opposition to CDL by the Authors Guild and their lawsuit against the Internet Archive. So we recognized that CDL was not without controversy, and there was a need for libraries to conduct a risk assessment for themselves. Since fair use is the copyright exception that underpins CDL, this kind of risk assessment is similar to what libraries do for other services, like electronic reserves and the digitization of collections for repositories, which also rely on the fair use exception in US copyright law. So since there are different approaches to CDL, there's also different strategies for that risk assessment and risk mitigation. Ways to mitigate risk include beginning with particular formats, like books, and/or focusing on particular services, like reserves. We anticipate and expect that each library will have its own risk assessment, and we really hoped that we could provide some guidance for doing that process. We also recognize that once you've done a risk assessment profile for your library, you still have to consider how to implement CDL. There are limited technology platforms currently for CDL, but there are some existing technologies that have been successfully adapted for some of the use cases for CDL. And there's a lot more work happening in this area by multiple vendors. So we'll discuss these new technological developments later in the presentation. And I'll turn it back over to John to discuss the evolution of the process of creating the Future Thinking Guide.
Thanks, Lisa. And as without fail, there's somebody outside my window with a leaf blower. So apologies for any background noise. This is an evolution, somewhat rapid evolution over the last year because of the pandemic. But we've been talking about CDL on and off for a while. Somewhat in response to the Internet Archive lawsuit. People were sort of asking me questions on the sly. Do you know anything? Don't say it's me, but do you know if anybody's doing anything with this? We're thinking about it, but it's just me and a couple of people. So we decided, let's convene those folks who are curious, CDL curious, and just have a very informal discussion group. It was Robyn Weisman who came up with the name CDL on the DL. And we've been meeting on and off, again, informally. We don't take notes. Nobody's, being anything being ascribed to any person or library. Just to really sort of see what's going on. And there have been a handful of small scale pilot projects going on in a few of our libraries, mostly with internal audiences. But people were definitely looking to see if there's a way that they could do more. They were hearing from their deans about this. They were hearing from their users about this. There's also a group of people who have jobs like me, different people in different consortia who were starting to go through the same kinds of processes. Some were a bit more directive and organized, sort of, some were more organic and grassroots. So we're starting to see more and more groups. The CDLI Implementers group, the Library Futures group that Tucky's involved with, the CIRC group that's part of Library Futures. So we really wanted to sort of see what we could do to advance the conversation, something beyond the legal theory that was first posited in the white paper, but also not sort of advocating for one side or another. So we came up with our guide. It was very carefully reviewed, more so than I would have expected. We had 6 different lawyers look at it, including the 2 who wrote the first white paper. So, we're very comfortable that it is on a solid legal basis and has been very positively received in the community. So we're very happy about that. I am going to turn it over back to Robyn Sinn.
Thank you, John. So we put together this group of volunteers interested from different angles around CDL and worked on our Google Drive documents and pasted and cut over and rewrote. And we ended up with this 7-page document, very lovely. We want to thank Wes Kennedy for the lovely graphic that heads it up. And we think it does what we set out to do, which is make that bridge between theory and practice and give people enough understanding and point back to the resources if they want more understanding of CDL and its underpinnings. But this is more about, okay, so if I'm in a reserve unit, what do I need to think about or consider? Or if I'm an administrator, what are the risks and who would I chat with about that? So we're hoping that it goes through and gives as many of these stakeholders within the library a way to think about CDL and wrap their brains around, oh, now what do I do and what should I consider and who do I talk to? So it's been pretty well received, as John was saying. and we got invited here. So some people think it's going to be useful, and that's all we really hope, is that it is useful. So Tucky's going to talk now more about implementation, which I know is a huge question.
So I was working at the University of South Carolina last fall when all of a sudden CDL went from being a random concept that copyright librarians like to talk about to something everybody in the world wanted to know about. And so I was told to go out and see what platforms were available. And at the time, there was really not a whole lot out there. The first place that we went to look for platforms were ebook platforms, because that made sense to us. That's what we want to do. But unfortunately, we contacted Overdrive, we contacted Biblioteca, but none of them wanted to take our money because they all are reliant on their relationships with publishers, which makes sense, but was disappointing to us. So we went out and looked at a lot of different options. And one of the options that might be available to you is if you use Alma. Alma Digital, which is their repository product, does have the ability to do controlled digital lending. So I know that there are a lot of us who are up on Alma. That might be a solution. It is certainly not inexpensive, and it will only work for you if you are an Alma library, obviously. In contrast to that is the Open Library with the Internet Archive. They do have a solution that is available to libraries for free. I know that it's called the Open Library. It's reviewed on Circ, and I can send you some more information about Circ so where you can read the review. But I think they have over 80 libraries in the Open Library right now, and it's a good solution if it fits the particulars of your needs. A couple of other solutions that are out there right now are a little bit more homegrown. I know that Fordham University has found a way to work with G Suite Google Workspace. So if your campus has G Suite Google Workspace, there is the ability to tweak that drive with some code that they've made available on GitHub to be able to do controlled digital lending. That was particularly useful for reserves when they were trying to do one-offs. Occam's Reader also has the ability to lend in days. If you're trying to do reserves, it's not as helpful, but if you're trying to do controlled digital lending where books are going to be checked out for several days, then that's an option. So there's some other models that I like to call Frankenstein solutions, where people in desperation have cobbled together a way to control digital rights, a way to control reservations, and then they manually check things out, only with it's an online item that you're checking out. And those work if you're desperate to check out textbooks for reserves during a pandemic, but maybe not as elegant a solution as most libraries would like to have. And there are a number of other library vendors that are working to create platforms. I know eReserves Plus, which has a great reserves product, is trying to create a platform for controlled digital lending that they're hoping to launch in the fall. But so there's a lot going on, and it's very hard to keep track of what's going on this minute. And so one of the things that a number of librarians, we're not really affiliated with any group, but the CIRC project is a random group of wayward libraries trying to track the platforms that are coming up so that other people don't have to memorize all of this. And I'll throw the link in the chat. But we are posting reviews of the platform solutions that are available to us now. And so if you don't want to have to keep track of them all, then we are trying to do that for you. I can say that the Fordham solution is not quite up there yet. And there is another one that should also be, we are hoping to have 2 posted this week. So right now we've got the Open Library from the Internet Archive, Alma, and one other solution is up there. So look for more to come. So the CIRC project is tracking all that, so you don't have to. And I also wanted to mention there are a couple of group efforts that are coming together to form community. And the CDLI Implementers group, if you're not part of that Google group, I'll also throw the link to that in the chat. If you're not part of that group and you want to learn more about controlled digital lending, they have a very active listserv. They have a very active meeting. I think they meet once a month. And then also you may want to follow the work of Library Futures, who is working to advocate on this. So, and I'm not sure who goes next.
That is me. I'll take over from here. After the Future Thinking document was released and ASERL libraries had time to digest it, the next challenge was to try and address how to implement CDL. There are 38 ASERL libraries of varying sizes and considerations, so making something like a specific step-by-step guide was not feasible. We decided to create a new group to build on the guide, focusing on desired technology, and to create use case scenarios that will be released publicly for libraries to use as a basic framework for potential implementation in their specific libraries. The use case scenarios focus on the areas of sharing content via e-reserves, sharing material not available as ebooks, and sharing materials with other libraries. This document is currently in progress. None of the group members have any comprehensive experience with use case scenarios, so it is being reviewed by more experienced colleagues to make sure that we're doing it right, essentially, before we go back to fine tuning it. And I actually think it just came back in this morning, so the progress is coming right along. We hope to have it available publicly sometime in the fall semester under a Creative Commons license in the same way we did with the Future Thinking Guide. So thank you for coming to our presentation. That's about all we have. We're excited that people are finding the Future Thinking document useful, and we're happy to answer any questions that you might have. Because ASERL CDL meetings operate under Chatham House rules, hence the name CDL on the DL is important. We may not be able to get into the nitty-gritty of what specific institutions are doing, but we're happy to answer questions in a general sense without tying back to any practice to a specific institution unless they've previously stated it's okay. So bombs away, fire off the questions.
Great, thank you guys so much for that whirlwind tour. Just remind everyone that they can use the Q&A tool to put their questions in. I've got a few questions from my side, so I'll take the moderator's privilege to go ahead and ask that. I was really interested in how you represented and tried to address the perspectives of different stakeholders, and I wonder what kind of feedback you'd gotten from some of those stakeholder groups to the guide.
When you say stakeholders, are you thinking, people outside of libraries and the publishing community and that sort of thing?
Oh, no, I was thinking the university stakeholders that might have questions or concerns about the project. I don't know if the idea of controlled digital lending, is known particularly outside of libraries. People want their stuff and they don't really care what it takes to get it. So that's up to the librarians to figure that out. So that said, libraries have spent a great deal of effort over the past year plus trying to make sure that they continue to stay in contact with their users, even though both the librarians and the staff are now remotely located, so very little face-to-face contact. So I don't know, I will toss it to my practicing librarian colleagues to see if they have had any sort of input on sort of CDL as a concept with their colleagues. No, not yet. Maybe it's too early.
I'll jump in and I'll say not necessarily internally from Vanderbilt, but we've gotten outreach from other librarians at different institutions asking questions in various capacities, whether from scholarly communication, from the resource sharing side. So it seems to be making an impact kind of nationally amongst particularly academic libraries. So there's that.
Mm-hmm. And have you heard from other consortia who might be looking to put together guides of their own?
I wouldn't say that they're looking to put together guides of their own sort of to duplicate this. There are different consortia are in different places in terms of their resource sharing systems. Some of them have sort of mandatory tools and very sort of formalized protocols and turnaround times and that sort of stuff. They tend to be the ones who say, okay, we're going to expand into CDL, but that's a very general rule of thumb. I would say that people are in very different places right now in terms of their readiness to implement CDL on a large scale basis.
Great. We've got a couple of questions that have come through in the chat. From Helen, what are some of the risks an institution should consider with CDL? And I'm sure there are very different perspectives you could use to answer that question. So do we maybe want to start with legal risks?
Yeah, so Helen, legal risks is certainly one aspect, and there are various ways that that risk could be mitigated. If you go to the Kyle Courtney and Dave Hansen white paper, they actually have a section where they kind of go through ways of mitigating that risk, particularly looking at books, which is where most people start with CDL. And the fact that under US copyright law, there was a requirement to renew copyright. And we don't know how many books haven't had their copyright renewed, but we know that that is certainly a factor, and that, you know, some of the books sitting on our bookshelves in our libraries are actually public domain. And so when you talk about kind of a risk mitigation strategy, it can either be, you know, what types of materials you're choosing to make available through CDL, and then the process by which you might do that. You might be more comfortable with things earlier in the 20th century than things later in the 20th century. One aspect of it is whether or not there's a copy available as an ebook, for example. And then finally, like what do you really want to focus on for CDL? So, you know, do you want to have a more narrow service like reserved, or a broader service like, you know, any book in your collection? And so, you know, that's part of why we kind of did the guide is, you know, to give folks things to think through and consider within their institution. I know one institution that shall remain nameless that uses CDL primarily for faculty or students who are not in the United States. You know, so that is a different way to kind of narrow how CDL is implemented. So you really need to consider what service you're trying to accomplish, and then how risk averse or how risk tolerant your institution is. And if you don't mind, there's a next question on digitizing a DVD for streaming that is in the chat that came to panelists that I can jump to as well because it's related. So Camille asks, anyone want to comment on CDL for DVDs, digitizing a DVD for streaming for course purposes when the film is not otherwise available through commercial streamers? So streaming for courses may be an implementation of CDL, but it may just simply be fair use. So CDL is really the idea of a loaned to owned ratio, and tends to focus a little more on checking things out. So streaming is a little less checking things out and making things available in a different way. But the idea that you may, you know, maybe streaming a DVD and not making it available would be certainly one approach. So again, this is back to a fair use analysis. There are institutions that are doing streaming in certain circumstances, often tied to specific classes rather than just streaming to everyone, to all authorized users, for example. And so there are ways of setting up a service like that to mitigate some of that risk. And so, you know, streaming from DVDs is something that some institutions do, but they're probably not thinking of it as exactly controlled digital lending, but still as part of a fair use analysis.
Does anyone else want to weigh in on that topic? Okay, there's another fair use question. This one's from Rachel. Since CDL relies on fair use, are fair use decisions at your institutions made by library staff or by the instructors? I'm supposing it varies, but maybe you could talk to that a little bit.
Yeah, I would say it varies. I mean, I think it varies across libraries and it varies across ASERL institutions. I would say it is more typical that a fair use decision may be done by a faculty member with course reserves. I think for CDL, we really did not contemplate a faculty member or a student making that kind of determination because we were really thinking of it in terms of a library service. And one that library staff would have to implement in some way. So I know there's some questions around, you know, what do you do with the loan to owned ratio? What do you do with a print copy when you're making another copy available? So I'll let others comment on that because that is, you know, definitely a workflow consideration. But we were really looking for CDL as something that was a library service where the risk analysis and the decision would be at the institution level for that service being provided by the library.
Tucky, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to echo what Lisa said, that CDL is more of a library-driven decision. When I worked at the University of South Carolina, the CDL decisions were part of what our workflow was for the library. But when you're working with reserves, which was also part of my position there, you almost can't do a fair use calculation without input from the faculty member because you have to know how the material is being used. And I don't want to, sometimes you know, but oftentimes you're just guessing and it's better to actually know. So it's a collaboration if it's a reserves type question.
Great. There's another question that touches on the risk analysis, and this is from Micah. When you talk about institutions doing their own risk analysis, is that an overall analysis of the risks associated with the institution participating in CDL, or is it at the item level? And if institutions are doing item level, you know, how does that play out?
So I can start and ask others to chime in. So whether or not you're doing that risk assessment for the service overall includes checking things by item would, I think, be part of your analysis. So let's say you hypothetically are looking at doing a CDL implementation for every book in your collection for a certain period of time. Like, let's just say from, I don't know, 1930 to 1950, I'll pick random dates. You know, whether or not you are comfortable saying we will do this for this period of time and we will do no further checking, you know, is a risk assessment, because some of those books are likely public domain and some are likely not. And you would not necessarily know, like, are any of those books available currently on the market as an ebook, for example. You may not be as comfortable for a 20-year swath doing that for, you know, 1990 to 2010, for example, where, you know, things are much more likely to be currently protected by copyright, more likely to be available as an ebook, just a different market at that point in time. And so, you know, at that point, if you are interested and have a service where you think that's worthwhile, then it could be part of your risk analysis of actually checking item by item for a request for things in that time period. So it's not necessarily an either all-encompassing rule or item by item. It could be some combination of the two, depending on the service you're looking to offer and, you know, the kinds of materials that you're considering. So I hope that helps break it down. And if anyone else has anything to add, feel free.
Okay, we'll keep moving along. So we have a question from Lori. Have you implemented central storage for items being loaned through CDL?
I'll start. You know, ASERL as an organization, you know, is the 30 plus libraries in 11 states. So we don't have a central storage facility. As far as I know, only one state within our region has a statewide facility. And I'm not aware that they've implemented CDL out of that facility. There are, in some cases, groups of libraries, sort of subsets. Some of them are in ASERL, some of them are not, where they have gone in together into to sort of sharing the costs and labor of storage facilities, but I don't have any details about that. I'm not aware of anybody doing it that way, even outside of ASERL, where there are sort of large consortial storage agreements. I'm not aware of anybody doing CDL out of those facilities. But disabuse me of that if I'm wrong.
The only stories I've heard in groups where, you know, Chatham House rules, so we don't share who's doing what. You know, some people, if a book is going to be loaned through CDL so that it's not checked out, it will be put in a room somewhere. Sometimes it's somebody's office, depending on how big their program is. Others, I know of at least one that just makes the book non-circulating. If there's been a request for reserves to use it in a CDL fashion, they just make it non-circulating, but leave it on the shelf so that nobody can check it out. So there's, but yeah, I've not heard of a central storage area being, you know, it seems a little heavy-handed to send it away rather than sequester it in the building where it usually lives. But yeah.
Anyone else have anything to add anecdotally? Like the idea of like the book being in like timeout or something like that. We have another question. Are there publishers that stand out, even if they're not fully supportive? Are there publishers in the discussion that are amenable to CDL?
I could say a little bit to that. I do not know of any publishers that have really weighed in on this in a positive way. I can say that there are publishers that are willing to sell, not license books to libraries, and the Internet Archive has been working to help libraries in that regard. And they're on it. I'm pretty sure it's on their blog, but if somebody wants to email me, I can throw my email in the chat. I do know that there are some publishers that are willing to sell books to libraries. So they're smaller presses, though. They were not ones that I was familiar with.
And I'm hearing sort of anecdotal things that university presses are a little more willing to have the conversation. Certainly the publishing industry has come out pretty strongly against CDL. You know, and I don't have the text of the guide in front of me, but at one point they called it an invented legal theory. You know, so for publishers who are only listening to publishers, you know, I imagine that they aren't hearing sort of what the librarians have to say. And I certainly know of at least one university press that sort of walked into a conversation with a very negative attitude, and after having, you know, a heart-to-heart with the libraries, and particularly around the own-to-loan issue, once they understand that is the control and controlled digital lending, that changes a lot of minds, or at least starts to change minds.
Okay, we have a question. Have there been, this is from Andrew, have there been any recent court decisions dealing with CDL?
There haven't been court decisions, but there is an active lawsuit from members of the Authors Guild against Internet Archive, specifically for the National Emergency Library. So whenever you're talking about fair use, facts matter. So it's important to understand exactly what Internet Archive was doing with the National Emergency Library, and how Internet Archive functions. And so at the time that the lawsuit was brought, the National Emergency Library was really loaning under the pandemic, because this was when we were smack dab in the midst of the pandemic. So they were loaning more digital copies than they had physical copies of in response to the pandemic, trying to help school children and others who were, trying to do work when they didn't have access to physical facilities. And so, that lawsuit is ongoing, and quite frankly, will take years, as these things do, unless it's settled. And we will see what happens with the courts. I will also say there's information out there. Internet Archive has, made information available from their perspective, and Authors Guild has made information available from their perspective. So if you do a little Googling, you can find kind of both perspectives on this question. But I would say, if you are considering that lawsuit, understand the details of the practice that is at issue. Because in fact, Internet Archive had been doing a version of CDL for a number of years prior to this. And CDL has many different ways it can be implemented. So take the lawsuit as a lesson, but, learn about it, know what exactly is at issue before you simply say there's a lawsuit. And therefore everything must stop, And Chris Freeland, who's at Internet Archive, pointed out that the lawsuit against Internet Archive is from 4 publishers, not the Authors Guild. And that is not uncommon. It is probably because the Authors Guild would not have what is called standing, because the Authors Guild themselves do not own copyright in the works. The publishers frequently are the ones who own copyright in the works. But the Authors Guild has been very supportive of this lawsuit. They were also very supportive of the lawsuit against HathiTrust and against Google Books. So we have been here in a similar situation previously with lawsuits.
Okay, we have a question from Jenny. How does CDL intersect with other common library practices like interlibrary loan?
I can jump in on this one. Interlibrary loan and CDL, frankly, not really going on in any large scale at this point, if for no other reason than because of the DL nature of CDL, libraries aren't really advertising what they're doing. So it's hard to know what libraries are offering it. And it's also even difficult to make it go live for each individual library, much less to start sending these materials off to other libraries. That being said, it's not something that isn't being discussed. The Controlled Digital Lending Working Group that operates off of Google, that we've talked about before, that's kind of run by Kyle Courtney, is working on kind of a position statement for CDL as it directly relates to interlibrary loan. I know they have it posted on the group, and we're kind of looking for comment. So that's out there if you want to take a look to see what kind of the position statement is towards interlibrary loan. It's definitely something that is on everyone's minds, and as a resource sharing librarian, it's definitely something that we want to pursue down the line with other libraries, but because of kind of the legal risks and liabilities that kind of go along with just CDL and its loan, to kind of add the dimension of interlibrary loan is kind of prohibitive at this point.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that? Okay, I have a kind of a hypothetical question that was submitted prior to the event. And so this would be for the librarians. if you could choose between CDL for books held in print from publisher X and permanently licensing the ebook of those same print books from publisher X at a reasonable price with a license clause allowing whole book ILL, would you consider both options openly? Would one be more attractive than the other? It's very hypothetical.
I'll take a stab at that. Back when I worked at I no longer work there, so I'm not speaking for the University of South Carolina. We always considered what the publisher had offered. For us, just from a workflow perspective, it was convenient and reasonable for us to purchase, products from vendors so that we could more easily do our jobs. That being said, we have to be able to buy what we need. And if we're most licensing, it depends on the license. The license could say anything from you have the full fair use rights and all the other rights that you normally have to, you could agree to wear red shoes and face east on Tuesdays while doing a tap dance. And so it really just, it just depends on what the license says. But we always look there. Our first question is, can we get somebody else to do the work for us? Because we don't have an infinite amount of staff, but libraries want to buy these books with the rights that we need to do our job. Preservation rights, the ability to lend to other libraries is just, right now, the reality is we can't buy them. And oftentimes we can't even license, sorry, I'm gonna go on a rant, but I'll get off that rant. But yeah, I mean, why couldn't I license Germs, Guns, and Steel? It's easily available on Kindle. But for the 30 years that I was at the University of South Carolina, I couldn't get that. And it was taught in 8 different classes. It was ridiculous. Sorry, that is my thoughts.
I think the other aspect to this is, can we buy book by book, or do we have to buy in a package? Because during the pandemic, we did what many libraries did, and that is, increased our ebook collections. And there was one instance where we needed and wanted 3 books, as Tucky said, being used in classes. We had to purchase a whole package that was like $14,000. So then your 3 books cost $14,000. So, the Tucky is correct in that in some cases, not every case, but in some cases, the models being used to sell ebooks and the rights that we are being given as libraries don't match the needs that we're trying to meet on our campuses. And that is a national issue. ALA has weighed in. The state of Maryland recently passed a law about libraries and books. And I don't know, Robyn, since you're in Maryland, if you have any comment on that, but this is an issue far beyond CDL and a long-standing issue.
Nothing to add except great cheering going on in Maryland.
Great. I have one more question, and I don't see any new ones coming to the chat, so or the Q&A, but if you do have one, please go ahead and put one in because we have just a few more minutes. But I wanted to ask about accessibility access. When I was reading through some of the materials around CDL, that's a topic that I've been paying pretty close attention to recently. And how does CDL affect print disability requirements and the like? Any impact? I thought I read it somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, it could be used for that purpose. HathiTrust is an example where you can register with HathiTrust and get digital copies in formats for students who have disabilities of varying kinds. So that's really a little less a fair use analysis and more under 121 as an exception in copyright law that allows for providing works to people with disabilities in formats that facilitate their use of those works. So it definitely happens in libraries. HathiTrust is one way of doing that. Libraries can also do various services for themselves, for their users. But I would say it's perhaps a bit tangential to CDL, you know, related, but slightly different, because the law has a special exception specifically for those with disabilities.
I lied, one more question. You mentioned when this project started out, approaching different platform providers and them really not being interested in having a discussion because their revenue models are dependent upon publishers. I'm just wondering, libraries do have a lot of clout if they operate together. Is there anything that you see coming, or any changes you might see coming on that front, or are these other access mechanisms kind of racing past that and that's really not relevant anymore?
When I had the experience of talking to the platforms at the beginning, they didn't know what CDL was. You're talking to a general salesperson. He goes to their publisher person, and it was just so much of a non-issue to them that they were just like, don't even bother with this. It was sort of the feeling that I was getting. One of the salespeople just said the publisher relationship people have a lot of clout in these organizations. So I think it was just so new that no one knew about it. And I think that if people have money, that people will listen. So, but I think that the more natural partners are not these people that will be beholden to publishers, because they have to, I mean, they want to provide ebooks. They're going to have a relationship with the publishers, and it's going to be very messy. But a platform like Ex Libris, or another library like the Internet Archive, or eReserves Plus, whose job is to make an eReserves platform. Those are more natural relationships for CDL. So I think that looking to organizations that that actually work for libraries might be more promising, but that's my perspective.
Okay, and we have one last minute question. It's a very similar question coming in from both Myrna and Mariah. So I'll just read one of them. But using CDL for Myrna, are there publishers out there willing to facilitate DCL of ebooks among libraries in developing countries the same way we can do interlibrary loan for the print books that we purchase? I know someone mentioned, maybe it was Lisa, non-US, is it a whole different kettle of fish? So maybe that's the answer to this question, but anyone want to?
I'm not aware of any particular publisher that sort of has that process, policy, rule, but others may know differently.
I don't see a publisher as being the natural leader in this. I think libraries are trying to exercise their rights, and a publisher leading the charge for libraries' rights would be odd. But back to the Internet Archive, working with publishers to actually get them to sell books as opposed to license books. There are some small publishers out there that are willing to sell books as digital books to libraries, not license but sell. So maybe that is more akin to that.
I guess my poke as the one of the scholarly communication librarian on the call is, if the publishers want to make their books available in, LMIC countries, make them open access, and then it's done.
That is a good note to end on as we move into the last minute of the hour. I want to thank all of our speakers who joined us here today. Thank the team, the technical team at Charleston, for facilitating this. I know that Internet Archive is running an FAQ webinar tomorrow, so we squeaked them on this, but Chris Freeland, who's here, had sent information on that. I've attended prior webinars and found them extremely useful to clarifying some of the questions here. So thanks everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and do return the survey. That helps us a lot in future programming decisions. Thanks so much.